Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. So it's getting to that time of year where hopefully you are cleaning your vendor master file and now you're wondering about your vendor data. That always happens. So you might be wondering why you have some missing tax IDs, why some tax ID legal name combinations didn't pass your latest validation with IRS TIN records. And you're probably also wondering how you can ensure that what you collect in the future is valid. So this IRS Form W-9 Series is for you. In this episode, we're talking about common mistakes for vendors in that first tax classification. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 302, IRS Form W-9 Series, Common Mistakes for Vendors that are Individuals, Sole Proprietors. So first of all, I started off by saying that this time of year, hopefully you are cleaning your vendor master file. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that you are reviewing your vendor records, all your active vendor records, and you are inactivating vendors that no longer do business with your company. You can identify what threshold month of activity that is, 15, 18, 24. I've seen 36, but I think that's too long because at that point the information is stale. And then you go through several more steps for the remaining active vendors to make sure their information is still valid, because vendors won't tell you all the time when things change. Just in the last episode 301, I suggested that you collect a W-9 for the exact same reason, and that way you can catch any of those name changes or tax ID changes that triggered the bank change, and now you get to verify that the legal name and tax ID still matches, and if it doesn't, now you can verify the new legal name tax ID combination matches so you can update your records. And so you should do that when you're cleaning your vendor master file. And when you're cleaning your vendor master file, part of that process is to do a bulk upload TIN match. And I say bulk upload because I'm assuming everyone has too many active vendors to one by one do an IRS TIN match lookup. But if you don't have that many vendors and you don't have a way to create a file for a bulk upload TIN match, either with IRS or with another resource, or you just don't have the ability to do a bulk upload because maybe you're not registered with the IRS where you can do a free one, and maybe you don't have any other options. I've seen it all, so don't feel bad if that is you, but you do need to make sure you're checking it somehow. And for those that do not pass the IRS TIN match, meaning their legal name tax ID did not match IRS records, then you need to go back to them and you need to collect a W-9 with a valid tax ID and legal name combination. And if you are collecting that from vendors that will select the individual / sole proprietor tax classification, the first one. And remember, if you don't know already, the W-9 did update. So the IRS published a March 2024 version on March 6th. And so make sure you're collecting that one. And that first tax class, the label of it or description did change. It went from individual sole proprietor / single member LLC to individual / sole proprietor. But it's still the same form or same tax class because single member LLCs are really treated like sole proprietors. And so they will still select that tax class per the IRS instructions, as long as they haven't filed a Form 2553. I think that's the number of it in order to be taxed as an S corporation, but that is a whole nother podcast. So again, we're going back to the common mistakes for vendors that are individual sole proprietors, but single member LLCs may be included in that as well. Okay, so let's get to those common mistakes. So I have 3 of them. Now, I will tell you this first one is the doozy. This is the one that used to make us, when I was a practitioner, send those W-9s back to the vendors because they did not put their first name and last name on line 1. And if their invoice was going to come in a different name, they did not put that on line 2. Most of them would put the name that the invoice was going to come in, if it was different, on line 1 and wouldn't even put their first name or last name. And this will be very obvious when you receive the W-9 because the first tax class of individual sole proprietor will be checked, but their first name and last name will not be on line 1. It'll be the name that their invoices are coming in. That's their DBA or disregarded entity name and not their first name, last name. So that's one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen as a practitioner for that first tax class of vendors that they make. And that was the biggest reason by far that we would send those W-9s back for correction. Now, I will say on the latest version of the IRS Form W-9, the IRS does tell them in the description of that line 1 that if they are sole proprietor individual, that they are supposed to put their first name and last name. Now that's new. They didn't used to have that in the description for that line. Hopefully the vendors now will read it and will give you their first name and last name. I think the biggest problem is that the vendors don't understand the language of disregarded entity. And so they may think that they need to put, let's say if you have John Doe and John Doe is a individual sole proprietor, he's got a lawn service and he's going to send you an invoice in the name of Doe Lawn Service. To him, that's not a disregarded entity, not quite sure what that is, but he's not seeing it as a DBA. And so he thinks it needs to go on line 1 instead of his first name and last name and the disregarded entity, right, of Doe Lawn Service on line 2. All right, so that was the first, and I think it's the biggest common mistake. Maybe it's not the biggest reason why you send your W-9s back, but I would guess that most of you listeners out there have had that issue in the past at least a few times. It's not a rare happening. The other 2, I'm not quite so sure they've happened to everyone, but probably. So the next one is the vendor gives you both the SSN and the EIN. And yes, these vendors can have both an SSN, right? Because they would have one anyway. And then if they have employees, they are required to withhold payroll tax. And in order to pay the IRS or deposit the payroll taxes that they withheld from their employees to the IRS, they need an EIN number. And so they can have both an EIN number. And as a matter of fact, for sole proprietors, the IRS will accept an EIN number if you collect that on the W-9, but they actually prefer a social security number. But if you do have a vendor that has both, then the problem is going to come if they include both on the W-9, because if they submit the W-9 and that W-9 gets to the AP or the vendor team and someone makes a choice, right? You really should have, as part of your desktop procedures or your process for setting up new vendor records, if you have both, which one are you going to use? So it's not one employee one day making the choice of an SSN versus another employee another day making the choice of an EIN, and then vice versa. Have that identified. And by the way, yes, I did just say that for sole proprietors, the IRS prefers the Social Security number. But I would say, especially if you don't have your system locked down, it's less of a breach if the EIN gets exposed versus the SSN getting exposed. So I would always, the IRS doesn't pay attention to Debra, but I always prefer collecting and retaining the EIN versus the SSN if we had a choice. But I will tell you too that again, if you have both, one employee may put in the SSN, one may put in the EIN. So now you have a risk, right? If that W-9 gets floating around, comes back again, someone doesn't check to verify whether or not the other tax ID is in there, and then creates a new vendor record. And so using the other tax ID. And so now you had duplicate records in there for the same vendor. And that could lead to duplicate payments, and it could also be an indicator of fraud. And so when we received W-9s that had both the Social Security number and the EIN on it, because the vendor, right, just didn't know they only needed to give us one. And so they just gave us both. We would send those back, and we would request that they fill out the form again and omit one of the tax IDs. We didn't tell them which one to omit, because we didn't want to dictate that, but they needed to send that back with just one tax ID on the form. And to be fair here, there is nowhere where the IRS says that you can't accept a W-9 that has multiple tax IDs on it. But you can be stricter than what the IRS requires. You have to require everything that they require, but you can be more strict than the IRS. You can say, no, we will not accept W-9s that have multiple tax IDs on them. And that is exactly what we did. Now, speaking of, you can be more strict than the IRS requires, that is a great segue to the third common mistake for vendors that are individuals and sole proprietors. And this comes with those vendors that are husband and wife. And so I often get asked if they can be on the same W-9, and absolutely, yes, they can. The IRS instructions even goes as far as to say that the husband and wife, right, they need to circle the spouse whose Social Security number is provided on the form. They don't say you have to. It's just preferred that they circle it. Now, if the husband and wife don't circle the spouse whose Social Security number is on the W-9, then the IRS says that you can just assume that it is the first spouse on the form. Again, here's where you can be stricter than the IRS. We would absolutely send those W-9s back as well that had a husband and wife on it, where it was not circled or the spouse wasn't circled. And that was because we had in our policy or naming conventions that on the vendor record, we would put the spouse's name first, whose Social Security number was included on the form, because we would put that Social Security number on the vendor record, and we would have that spouse's name listed first in the legal name field. And that was because we just didn't want to go back and check all those W-9s to verify whose tax ID we had, right? Because if we didn't have a standardized way of inputting them, then we would have to go and check those W-9s if we ever needed to know whose social security number or which social security number we collected, one spouse or the other. Okay, so those are the 3 common mistakes that I found when I was a practitioner, and maybe those are things that you have seen as well. And all 3 of these, by the way, in my opinion, means you need to send those back and get the vendor to correct them. But I do understand that everyone has a different set of vendors or different vendor mix. So make sure that you put your naming conventions, your policies, what's required when collecting the vendor record in place according to your company, your vendor type, your industry. But whatever you do, make sure you document it so everybody's doing the same thing. All right, so that is it for today's episode. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 302nd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.